Good morning, everyone. Welcome to News Center Maine's Political Brew. Glad to be with you remotely again with Phil Harriman and John Richardson. Gentlemen, always good to see you, even when it's not in person.
Good morning,
Pat.
Let's get started. Plenty to talk about this morning. On Thursday, Governor Mills outlined some of her goals for a cautious reopening of Maine's economy. She says it'll be based on science and guidelines developed by the CDC, also going to take input from the public and from businesses. But really, Phil, there's not much there. What did you make of the approach so far?
Well, I thought it was timely for the governor to be seen and heard over the last week or so. It's been pretty much we're a Center for Disease Control at Department of Health and Human Services. But as you kind of say with a twinkle in your tongue, so to speak, she really didn't say a lot other than we're getting ready to get ready. And I think it's fair to say at this point, there's enough data nationally and internationally to give us a very clear picture of how this virus is behaving. And it is time to help people get back to work because a lot of people are struggling financially.
John, what do you think?
I liked Governor Mills's press conference because I thought that it continued to say that we're going to be guided by science, by data that will dictate what we do for this pandemic. I also like the fact that she said, we're going to put the people's health first and foremost, and we're going to look to make sure that we have enough healthcare facilities and have them open and able to respond if necessary. I also like the fact that she got the Commissioner of Economic Development involved and said, we can't do this alone. Government can't make all of this happen. We're going to need some help. And so we're looking to leverage the business community, call the Department of Economic Community Development with your ideas. I thought that was a great move.
Now, this approach so far is not likely to satisfy the people who rallied outside the Blaine House and the State House on last Monday, asking the governor to lift the stay-at-home order and start reopening the economy. Now, there's no doubt that many of the participants in that rally are genuinely concerned about their livelihoods and their economic futures. However, there's a political component to this too, isn't there, John?
There really is. And unfortunately, it really muddles their message. I mean, there are people there who are right to life advocates. There were people who are Second Amendment advocates. It seemed like a hodgepodge of protesters. And I think that undercut what I think was their main point they wanted to make, which is that, Governor, please listen to us. We want to open up the economy. I understand there's a lot of fear, and I understand that unemployment claims are not being processed fast enough and that sort of thing. But I do think the government's doing as much as it can. And I think that, but unfortunately for some, the patience is wearing out.
Phil, it was interesting that all of the Republican candidates for Congress in this coming year, the 3 in the 2nd district and the 1 in the 1st district, backed the rally. Though one, Adrian Bennett, chose not to attend in person, though she tweeted and put her support on social media. What does that say then about this idea that seeking an end to public safety-driven restrictions, but also following the warnings to stay at home? It seems like everyone's just trying to find their own way.
Yeah, I think you're right, Pat. The facts are now clear enough that we can, I think, safely begin to help people get back to work. And let's assume Adrian Bennett wasn't out knocking on doors, so to speak. But the optics there are they speak for themselves, which is why we're talking about it. You can't be in support of opening up the economy and not be there yourself. It's a mixed message.
And John, we've had some of the Republicans in the legislature making noise about Governor Mills and her approach. There was an open letter from Republican Representative Heidi Sampson of Alfred, who says in the daily briefings, it's repeatedly suggested for people to sit at home and continue watching Netflix. All the while, she says, people are disintegrating into desperation and despondency. This dismissive suggestion is very troubling. It illustrates a lack of comprehension for the wide-reaching implications of these mandates. Do you think this is laying the groundwork for some attacks on the governor and her administration in the fall? Is that part of this?
A coincidence? I think not. I mean, 60% of the people want to follow the shelter-in-place mandate that the governor has provided. Republicans are pretty evenly split, but half of the Republicans still think it's a good idea. I think what's largely happened is that between Governor Mills and Dr. Shaw, they have essentially sucked all of the air out of the political environment. And what now is happening is that people want to get back onto the stage. I mean, the Republicans are desperate to get back on the stage and have a message The message that they're pushing is, of course, let's open up the economy. Yet that open up the economy argument isn't even shared by most of Republicans.
Phil, do you think there is some political opportunism as an element of this?
Well, of course, whenever two or more legislators are gathered, there's a political agenda unfolding. But I think the facts as we look back on this time, 6 months from now, will speak for themselves. And I think up to this point, we have been one team, one Maine, one party, so to speak. But I think the time has come. And I think the letter that she released is indicative of how Maine people are feeling like, okay, we've done our job. It's clear that we've got this under control. Let's safely get back to work.
This past week, former Governor Paul LePage wrote a letter to President Trump pointing out the need for seasonal workers in Maine as the economy reopens and hoping that restrictions on immigration won't jeopardize the needs of the state. John, is this Paul LePage, again, perhaps looking ahead to his next political race, if there is one, or is this just the voice of reason, the public-spirited citizen?
You know, before Trump, we had LePage, and so that was my first reaction when I heard what the former governor was saying. I think it's kind of rich and ironic that this governor, a Tea Party Republican, is arguing that we ought to open up and have less restrictive immigration rules at the same time and on the same week that the president has basically closed the borders. You know, I get where we need seasonal workers, especially up and down the coast, and especially given our, you know, vacation land and our tourism-based industry. But I think that it's a little too early to be arguing to do this. I think we ought to be waiting to see what kind of influx we have. We may not have as much of an influx in terms of vacationers as we thought we might.
What do you think, Phil?
I think this is Paul LePage being Paul LePage, and I say that in a positive way because he does have a relationship with President Trump. And why wouldn't we want a Mainer to use whatever means of communication they can to get this matter the attention of the president? Because so much of our economy, perhaps as much as half of Maine's economy, is dependent upon tourists coming here and having a wonderful experience in the fresh outdoors of Maine. And we hopefully will open up our doors and need those workers, and hopefully the president will respond.
You've probably seen, it's hard to miss the ads. Opponents of Susan Collins have been criticizing the senator for the federal government not having enough medical supplies to meet the need during this pandemic. And there's no doubt that federal stockpiles are not as large as they should have been, apparently. But should some of the responsibility also fall on the state, Phil?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, Pat. And I think it also falls on the hospitals that we have in Maine to all of a sudden point our criticism at the president for not having enough protective gear or masks or ventilators is really unfair. What are we going to do if the next reason that we have to have an all hands on deck is we need dialysis machines or wheelchairs? Do we expect the federal government to have a stockpile to take care of every one of these situations around the country? No, I think these are state and local medical community duties to be prepared.
How about it, John?
Well, I think the argument about Collins, and I think that DeSay suggests that she was not helpful. We do know that she voted against the pandemic and the stimulus bill in 2009, but then again, later voted for some funding for the pandemic later on. I don't think the federal government was prepared. They certainly aren't prepared now, or especially coordinated. They're not very coordinated in their response. But I would say that after years and years and years of cuts to hospitals, cuts to Medicaid reimbursement rates, the hospitals have been really hamstrung to prepare for anything other than the most basic of needs. And you see rural hospitals in bankruptcy and that sort of thing around the country. So I think that, we can all point fingers and lay blame, but we ought to be looking later at this about what can we do moving forward, because this, I don't think, will be the last pandemic we ever see.
Now, we know Maine's economy is taking a beating from this pandemic and from the shutdowns and job losses. Do you think, John, that the legislature ought to be called back into session to start dealing with whatever cuts they're going to have to make, whatever adjustments are going to have to be made as our tax revenues take a dive?
I think that is a consideration. I think it's too early to say that the legislature ought to come in. I think that frankly, what would they come in for? Well, we ought to have a plan. We ought to have some rollout of the ideas that will be debated so that there's some organization and around the debate. I do think that the governor has right now the right under the chief executive's orders to curtail. And so curtailment has been something that Phil saw, I saw when I was in the legislature. The governor can do a very nice job of curtailing without ever calling in the legislature. And I wouldn't call them in at this moment because of the pandemic and the fear of bringing a lot of people in a very close quarters. But I do think if there was a strategic kind of focused approach towards what they need to address, then yes, we ought to think about it.
What do you think, Phil?
Well, I would agree with John if the governor was implementing curtailment orders, which I have not yet seen. And there's clearly I don't think there's any dispute that Maine's tax revenues are going to be off, and hopefully in a manageable way, but it doesn't at this point appear to be the case. If the politicians in Augusta or the city leaders in our municipalities around the state think that the best way to solve their problems is to increase taxes, I think they're in for a very rude awakening. Our economy has been shocked by this, and people are struggling to pay their bills, and the last thing they want to see is a tax increase.
All right, finally, John, let's start with our political winners and losers this week with you.
To me, the winners of the week are the nurses. All the nurses in the country have stood up against those who were protesting and wanting the economy reopened. These nurses sit on the front lines, and they really recognize the dramatic impact that the pandemic is having. To me, the loser of the week, the Georgia governor. Georgia, Governor, what are you thinking of doing in Georgia? Opening up, you're opening up tattoo parlors, bowling alleys, all kinds of things that are not essential. And as a result of that, I think you're going to see a high spike of pandemic cases in Georgia.
And Phil?
The losers of the week, in my view, are the well-endowed institutions of higher learning that have billions of dollars in endowments who sought money from the taxpayers when electricians and beauticians and others are still struggling to get some relief. The winner of the week is the president and the 50 governors around the country. From what I see, they are coordinated and working as a team, and it's up to the 50 states, as it should be, for them to decide how to move forward with their economy. They're my winners of the week.
All right, gentlemen, thank you. As always, stay safe. That's going to do it for News Center Maine's Political Brew. News Center Maine, back after this.